There is a place beyond all footsteps, a place not reached by road, nor river, nor wind, a boundary where thought loosens, where breath softens, where all stories eventually come to sit in quiet company. This place is known as the Quiet Shore. No one alive has seen it, yet all souls will one day recognize it. Feels like something you've known forever, the hush before sleep, the moment your heart slows just before dreams arrive, the silence beneath your last exhale. The quiet shore stretches out beneath a sky without sun or moon, a sky that glows on its own, as though lit from the memory of starlight. No wind moves here, no waves crash. Instead, the wide black river beside the shore flows like ink, drawn slowly across ancient parchment. This river has many names among the living. Some call it Styx, some call it Lethe, some call it the passage, the veil, the last crossing. But the river itself has no name for itself. It simply is. At the edge of this river, where sand meets shadow and water meets silence, stands the ferryman. He has stood there since the first mortal died. Not by command, not by punishment, not by desire, but because something in the fabric of the universe wove him into the place between a heartbeat and its echo. He is tall, draped in robes the color of dawnless night. His face is neither young nor old, and perhaps it never was either. His eyes reflect neither sorrow nor joy. They reflect only understanding, a deep quiet that has witnessed everything and judged nothing. In his hands he holds an oar, carved not from wood, but from the memory of all those who once reached for comfort. In their last moments, the ferryman guides souls across the river, but he is no captor. He does not pull them forward, nor does he push them. He simply waits, for souls arrive on the quiet shore. Not in crowds, not in lines, but in silence, one by one, like snowflakes drifting down in a world without wind. Some arrive confused, still holding onto the echo of their final pain, grasping for the warmth of bodies they no longer wear. Some arrive peacefully, as though a long-awaited journey has finally ended. Some arrive crying, some smiling, some silent as they were in life. Yet all of them look to him. The ferryman does not speak, but every soul understands him. The moment they see him, he is not death, he is not fate, he is not judge, he is companion. He stands so they do not cross alone. The river does not frighten them here. The surface is smooth as still glass. When souls step into the ferryman's small, dark boat, the water accepts them like an embrace, soft and unhurried. There is no rush. Time does not follow here. Nothing decays. Nothing grows. Nothing changes, or so it once was believed. On the quiet shore, there is no cold and no warmth, only a deep and endless calm, a quiet that seems to hum gently, as though the universe itself were breathing in sleep. Sometimes a soul arrives who has lived a short life, barely beginning to know the taste of the world. The ferryman bows his head for them, not in pity, but in recognition. Sometimes a soul arrives carrying centuries of memory. their lives layered like rings in the trunk of an ancient tree. For them he lifts his gaze, not in awe, but in witness. They all step into the boat the same way, weightless, breathless, free of every name they have ever been called, yet holding all their stories inside them, like embers that refuse to go dark. But on a day, or what passes for a day, in a place where days do not move, something changed. It began with a pause, not in the river, not in the souls, not even in time. It happened inside the ferryman. A small feeling, faint as dust settling on quiet stone. A shift, a question. For the first time since the first death, he felt tired. Not the tiredness of body, not the weariness of mind, but the exhaustion of eternity. An ache older than time. A longing not for rest alone, but for something to fill the space where meaning once lived. He looked down into the river, into the endless stream of endings, and saw not their peace, but the weight of his own solitude. He had carried every soul, but no one had ever carried him. No voice had spoken his name. No hand had touched his shoulder. No soul had ever asked, "Are you weary?" And so the ferryman stood, still as the stones beneath the quiet shore, with the shadow of a new thought stirring inside him. Quiet, slow, impossible. The thought that even death may one day long to rest. The quiet shore had always been silent, but now the silence had changed. It no longer felt like peace, felt like waiting. The ferryman stood beside the river as he always had. His posture had not shifted. His robes had not stirred. And yet, something within him was moving. He did not know how long he had stood in that single thought. Time did not pass here. Moments did not stack one upon another. There was no before, no after, only the endless now. And yet, something within him said, something has changed. The next soul approached slowly across the shore. She was an old woman, her hair as white and fine as winter frost, but her body moved lightly, without the weight of pain. She looked at her own hands, turning them slowly, marveling, as though she were seeing them for the first time. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, like someone speaking in a sacred library. "So this is where I have come." The ferryman did not answer. His silence was not refusal, merely the nature of things. She looked at him for a long time. "You've been here a very long while," she said. Her tone was not questioning. It was knowing. It was the voice of someone who had loved deeply, lost deeply, and learned to see without her eyes. The ferryman felt the ache again, the one without name, the silent heaviness that had no beginning. The woman smiled gently. "You carry so much for someone who carries no burden." The ferryman lowered his gaze. But for the first time he did not lower it as a reflex. He lowered it because he felt something inside him move. A tremor, a ripple, faint as a sigh. The old woman stepped toward the edge of the river. The water glowed faintly, reflecting nothing and everything. The surface did not show her face, only the echo of her final breath. She turned back toward him. "May I sit?" It was a question he had never heard before, because no one had ever asked. He did not speak aloud, but something in him softened, loosened, permitted. She sat beside him on the shore. The river whispered, the silence deepened, and neither of them moved. For a long while, though time did not measure how long, the two sat there as if they were simply two beings resting after a journey. No crossing, no guidance, no farewell, only presence. The woman looked into the river and smiled, a smile lined with sorrows remembered and released. "I was a midwife," she said softly. "I lived by the sea. I brought so many into the world. And now I suppose I have simply crossed the tide myself." Her voice was steady, not fearful. The ferryman listened, not because she expected him to, but because her words filled something that had long been empty. "I used to think," she said, "that death was a door that locked behind us. But now that I'm here, it feels more like a gate that was always open." She lowered her hand and let it hover just above the river's surface, not touching, only feeling. The river responded, a faint glow rising, greeting her. The ferryman watched. This was new. The river did not glow. The river did not answer. The river simply carried. But now it acknowledged. The woman's eyes glistened with something like wonder. "You listen," she said, "even if you do not speak. You have listened to everyone who has ever come here." Her voice trembled, not with sadness, but with recognition. That must be lonely. The silence in the ferryman was no longer empty. It was full, full of every voice that had never been spoken aloud, every goodbye that had dissolved into stillness, every final thought that had faded before becoming sound. He did not feel tears. He did not know if he could. But if he had been human, he would have wept. The old woman breathed slowly, peacefully. "You may rest, you know." The ferryman's hands tightened on the oar. Rest. The word moved through him like a stone dropped into deep water, ripples traveling into places he had never allowed himself to feel. To rest meant to be carried, to be supported, to be held. But there was no one to hold him, no one to guide him, no one to ferry him. He had always been the one who remained. The woman rose slowly and stepped toward the boat. But she did not step inside. She placed her hand gently on the ferryman's arm. Her touch was warm, or perhaps the warmth was simply the memory of warmth. "You have guided all of us," she said. "Let us sit with you now." The ferryman lifted his gaze. The souls waiting on the shore, the ones who had arrived before her, had not left. They sat. Some leaned against one another. Some lay on the sand. Some simply breathed quietly into the endless stillness. They were resting, not crossing, resting. The river did not command them. The fate of the afterlife did not urge them. Time did not push them forward. The world had changed, not with thunder, not with fire, but with a single quiet pause. The ferryman placed the oar on the ground beside him. Not dropped, not discarded. The ferryman sat beside the river, his oar resting on the sand like a memory laid to sleep. The souls gathered around him in quiet forms, their presences gentle, like mist resting on water. No voice commanded them, No journey urged them forward. They simply existed, together, in a stillness that had never been allowed before. For the first time, the ferryman looked not into the river, but across it. The river had always been the boundary between what once was and what would never be again. Its waters were neither cold nor warm. They merely were. They carried those who came to their end, and there was no choice in that journey. The river knew only one direction, forward. But now it was still. Its motion had not ceased, but its purpose had shifted. It no longer carried, it listened. The ferryman did not know how to name the change. There were no words here. Words belonged to life, to breath, to hearts that beat. And yet, something like thought moved through him, a ripple of awareness. The old woman who had sat beside him still rested near, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look like she waited for passage. She looked as though she had already arrived. She turned toward him slowly, her gaze soft. "Do you hear it?" she asked. The ferryman did not speak, but he listened. The river was whispering, not with voices, not with sound, but with memory. It was remembering. The river had always held the final traces of souls as they crossed. Their last breath, their last fear, their last hope. And now, with the ferry paused and the oar laid down, those impressions began to rise. Soft lights shimmered beneath the water's surface, shapes without form, echoes without source, like distant lanterns floating on a dark sea. The ferryman watched, and his still heart tightened. The river was full of every journey he had guided, full of every life that had ended, full of every story that had faded into silence. The river was not merely a path. It was memory. The souls felt it too. They turned their faces toward the water. Some began to weep, not from sorrow, but from recognition. To see one's life reflected, not as regret, nor as judgment, but simply as it was a grace that life rarely gave. One soul stepped closer, a young man with gentle eyes and hands that bore the shape of tools. He looked into the glow and smiled faintly. "I remember carving my first cradle," he whispered. "I was so afraid I would make it wrong. But when I placed the child in it, he laughed. I had never heard joy like that." The river answered by glowing brighter. Another soul, a scholar who had spent her life chasing meaning, gazed into the reflection of stars that were not stars. "I searched for truth in books," she said. "I believed I would find peace in knowing, but peace was in feeling. I wish I had learned that sooner." The river did not judge her. It held her words like precious offerings. The ferryman felt something shift in him again, a loosening, a release. His role had never been to erase their stories. It had been to carry them, and now perhaps to witness them. The old woman did not speak this time. She only watched him, patient, as though she understood the shape of every thought he could not form. He wondered for the first time where he had come from. Had he been born? Had he lived? Had he died? He searched the river for his own reflection, but the water did not show him. There was no memory of him to recall. The weight in his chest deepened. Not pain, not sorrow, but longing. A soul approached him then, a child. Her feet made no sound as she walked across the sand. Her hair hung weightless, as though underwater, and her eyes held a softness untouched by suffering. She looked not confused, nor frightened, but curious. She sat beside him without hesitation. "Are you lonely?" she asked. The ferryman lowered his head. She reached out and placed her small hand on top of his. The warmth of her touch spread through him like sunlight breaking through deep water. "It's all right," she said. "You don't have to be alone anymore." The words echoed inside him, not like sound, but like truth. The souls had remained. The old woman had seen him. The river had remembered. The silence had spoken. And now someone had touched him. The river brightened again. But this time, the light rose higher, swirling like mist lifting from the surface. It wrapped gently around the ferryman, like arms around shoulders, like a shawl in deep winter, like comfort. The river was not just memory. It was love. A love older than life, older than death, older than the first breath and the last. The ferryman felt the ache again, but now he recognized it. It was longing, longing for connection, for rest, for someone to see him. And now someone had. The child leaned her head against his arm and closed her eyes. The old woman smiled softly. The souls breathed as one. The river shone like a sky full of stars. The ferryman did not speak. But in the silence of the quiet shore, the world began to change. Not with sound, but with presence. Not with answers, but with understanding. Not with crossing, but with staying. The ferryman closed his eyes. And the river continued to remember. The quiet shore had once been nothing more than an end. A place where journeys concluded, where breath ceased, where the thread between heart and body dissolved into stillness. But now, the shore had begun to feel like something different. A threshold not of loss but of pause. The ferryman sat among the souls who had gathered, not as their guide, not as their keeper, simply as one among them. His oar lay where he had placed it, untouched. The river flowed softly, and the souls did not cross. They rested. They breathed without breath. They dreamed without sleep. Something ancient had shifted, and the river was listening. The old woman remained near the ferryman, her presence like the low glow of lantern embers. She did not speak again, not until the ferryman was ready to hear. Instead, it was the child who spoke first. She lifted her head from where it rested against the ferryman's arm. "Do you know your name?" she asked. The words moved through him like a breeze across still water. The question was not heavy. It was gentle. But gentle things can be the sharpest of all. The ferryman did not answer because he did not know. Names belonged to the living. Names came from love, from touch, from being called. The ferryman had never been called. He had only been needed. The souls watched him, not with pity, but with recognition. Many of them had forgotten their names too. The old woman finally spoke, her voice low and warm. "Names are given when one is welcomed," she said. "Perhaps yours was never given. Or perhaps it was taken." The ferryman lowered his gaze. The river responded, its glow deepening, gathering, as though drawing breath. And then, across the horizon where no sky existed, a sound rose. Not a sound of air, or wave or wind. A memory, the memory of drums. Far, far away, beyond the shore of endings, beyond the waking world, beyond the first dawn. Drums had once been played by hands that lived. Drums that marked birth. Drums that marked mourning. Drums that marked the crossing between life and the mystery beyond. The souls turned their heads as one. The river trembled, and something began to approach. Not a soul, not a living being, something older. A figure stepped from where the water met the horizon. A traveler wrapped in deep blue cloth, carrying no burden. Their face was neither young nor old. Their eyes held the color of deep ocean, the kind that remembers everything. The ferryman stood without meaning to. The traveler smiled, not with lips, but with presence. "You have paused the river," they said. Their voice was like a story being told for the 1,000th time. The ferryman did not reply. The river's glow rose and wrapped the traveler like a greeting. The traveler knelt beside the ferryman, not as a superior nor as a judge, as an equal. "You were not born," the traveler said gently. "You were made." The silence around them deepened. "You were shaped from the first sorrow ever felt, the first grief that clung to the heart of the living, the first tear that did not fall, because the one who would have wept did not yet understand they had lost something." The souls watched, still and listening. "You were not meant to guide," the traveler continued. "You were meant to witness." A whisper rippled through the souls, like wind passing through autumn leaves. The ferryman lifted his hands. They trembled. He had guided countless souls, held countless final breaths, been the last presence every mortal would ever see. But he had never been seen. The traveler reached out and placed their hand on top of his. Where the child's touch was warmth, the traveler's touch was remembrance. "You were made from grief," the traveler said, "but you were never meant to carry it alone. But you were never meant to carry it alone." The ferryman felt the ache again, sharper this time. The traveler looked at the souls gathered, the resting, the waiting, the remembering. "They have not crossed," the traveler said, "because they are waiting for you." The ferryman blinked, not with eyes, with awareness. "For me," the traveler nodded. "Everything that exists must one day rest. Even that which guides rest itself." The ferryman looked at the oar, still lying where he had placed it. "It is not time to cross," the traveler said. "It is time to understand." The river glowed brighter than it ever had. The child took the ferryman's hand again. The old woman placed her hand over his other. The souls gathered close, not in desperation, but in unity. The traveler's voice grew soft, like dusk settling. "This shore is no longer an ending." The river shimmered like starlight on dark water. "It is the first beginning." The ferryman felt something inside him open, like a door he had never known existed. Not memory, not identity, but possibility. The river no longer pulled. It invited. The souls no longer waited. They accompanied. The ferryman did not move to leave. He simply was. For the first time since death began, the quiet shore breathed, and the world beyond it listened. The river shimmered like a sky turned upside down, starlight drifting beneath its surface instead of above. The ferryman sat among the souls, no longer apart from them, no longer a distant figure of solemn purpose. His hands rested loosely upon his knees. The oar lay at his side, untouched, as though it were merely another piece of driftwood carried to shore by fate and time. The traveler remained nearby, seated where land met water, watching the river with eyes that had seen beginnings and endings layered atop one another. The old woman rested close enough that the warmth of her presence filled the silence without disturbing it. The child leaned against the ferryman, small fingers curled around his arm, as if she had known him forever. Nothing in the quiet shore moved quickly. Nothing needed to. There was no urgency here, no deadlines, no fear. The ferryman felt it all around him, the difference, the shift. The quiet that had once been emptiness was now full, thick as soft wool, comforting in its weight. The traveler spoke at last. "You must choose," they said. The ferryman did not turn his head. He did not need to. There was only one choice: to return to the river, or to remain on the shore. For ages beyond counting, his purpose had been singular: guide the souls across, ensure the journey continued, stand between life and what followed it. A bridge must never rest, path must never close. But the river had paused. The oar lay still, and the souls waited with him. "What happens?" the ferryman finally asked, and the question echoed not in sound but in the trembling stillness of the air. "If I cross?" The traveler smiled, a slow, knowing curve of presence rather than expression. "You will not know until you do." The old woman's hand found his again, gentle, grounding. "You have given everyone your quiet," she whispered. "Perhaps now it is time to receive." The child tilted her head, eyes deep as night. "We will go with you." The ferryman looked at the souls gathered. Those who had been warriors and mothers, scholars and singers, children and elders. Those who had arrived in fear and left it behind. Those who had crossed storms and dreams and darkness to arrive here. They were waiting not for the river, for him. He rose slowly from where he had been seated. The movement felt unfamiliar, as though his form had been carved to kneel, to wait, to ferry, but never to stand. His robes settled like soft waves around him. The oar lay before him, and he reached for it. But when his hand touched the wood, something changed. The oar did not feel like a tool anymore, felt like a story, his story. He lifted it, not with duty, but with remembrance. The souls rose with him not as followers, but as companions. The river glowed not with command, but invitation. The traveler stood and stepped aside. "This crossing will not be like the others," they said. "You will not leave the souls behind. They do not need you to guide them anymore. They choose to walk beside you." The ferryman stepped toward the boat, but this time he did not step aboard. Instead, the river rose. Water lifted like a curtain stirred by a soft wind. The surface widened, reshaped, becoming a path of shimmering light that stretched forward into horizonless night. Not a river anymore. A road. A passage that did not belong to endings or beginnings, but to what comes after both. The souls gathered around the ferryman, not behind him, and together they stepped onto the shimmering water. The child's hand tightened around his. The old woman stood beside him, steady as moonlight. The traveler watched, eyes warm. The ferryman looked back only once. The quiet shore was no longer empty. It was no longer waiting. It was simply peaceful. A place that had fulfilled its purpose. He did not know where the path led. He did not need to. There are journeys that are made not to arrive, but to become. The ferryman took his first step forward. The river glowed brighter. The souls moved as one, and the quiet shore exhaled. Not an ending, not a beginning, but a continuation, a breath, a becoming. And in the quiet beyond time, the ferryman walked. The path across the water widened like a breath, shimmering under a sky that belonged to neither night nor day. It was made of river light and memory. A road formed from all the journeys that had ever ended and all the tenderness that had ever followed. The ferryman walked upon it, not apart from the souls, but among them. Their footsteps made no sound, but the water remembered everyone. The child's hand held his. The old woman's presence steadied him like a fire at the end of a long winter. Around them, the gathered souls moved gently, unhurried, unafraid. No one asked where the path led. No one demanded an answer. The walking itself was the answer. Ahead, the horizon bent into a soft arc, like a bowl carved from the first darkness. The river's glow deepened as they approached, and the surface of the water grew still enough to mirror what lay within each traveler. Not faces, not bodies, those had been set down. The reflections were of quiet truths, unspoken promises, loves that had endured beyond the shape that once held them. The ferryman looked and saw no reflection of himself. He had expected that. He had never owned a past to reflect, never carried a name that could be called back from silence. Yet something stirred at the edge of awareness, as if the river were reaching for him with a patience that had waited since the first heartbeat. They came to a wide, circular basin at the end of the shining road. There were no shores here, only a vast, still expanse of water gathered as if listening. The traveler who had once appeared at the quiet shore was waiting, seated cross-legged upon the water as if seated upon memory itself. Their eyes were warm. Their presence did not command. It welcomed. "You have come far," the traveler said. The ferryman stood among the souls and felt no distance between them. He looked upon the traveler. He did not bow. He did not need to. Respect was no longer a posture. It was a truth shared by all present. "What is this place?" he asked, not with voice, but with presence. "A room where endings speak," the traveler replied, smiling. "A place that was always here, hidden beneath the need to hurry. It is called the Listening Waters." The child released the ferryman's hand only to kneel and cup her palms, as if to drink. The water rose to meet her touch without rippling. She did not drink. She only smiled and let the glow settle over her fingers like dust made of stars. "Why bring us here?" asked the old woman, her eyes deep with the kind of knowing that comes after surrender. "Because there is one more thing to remember," the traveler said. "A thing that belongs to him." They looked gently at the ferryman. The gathered souls did not move away. They drew closer, forming a circle upon the hushed basin. The ferryman stood at its heart, his oar resting against his shoulder like a staff worn smooth by centuries of accompaniment. He did not feel judged. He felt held. The traveler extended a hand. "Step forward," they said. "Place your palm upon the listening waters, and ask for what you do not know." The ferryman stepped. The water was cool, not with chill, but with clarity. He lowered his hand until his fingers touched the glow. "I do not know my name," he said, if saying could be done without sound. "I do not know who made me, or why I was given to the river." The basin brightened, and a pulse moved outward like a breath released after too long held. The traveler's voice was little more than a thread. "Listen." The water began to hum. Was not a music made for ears. It was the deep tone that lives beneath memory, the low chorus that carries grief without breaking and lifts love without claiming. Upon that hum, shapes formed, faint, quiet, and true. A world before language. A first loss that had no word. Hands reaching for hands that could no longer be held. A tear that did not fall because no one had yet taught the body how to weep. The hum held that moment as gently as a mother holds a sleeping child, as if the universe itself had bent to lay down the first grief in a cradle woven of its own light. From that grief, a figure rose, neither born nor crafted, but recognized. A presence shaped by the need the living could not name. A guide made of witness, a companion made of patience, a keeper made of kindness. The listening waters spoke without speaking. You were made when grief first learned it was not alone. The ferryman trembled, not with fear, but with belonging. The oar was no longer a tool. It was a memory carved into shape, smooth with the touch of a million departures. He looked down at his hands, hands that had steadied the living at the edge of unknowing, hands that had learned to hold silence as if it were a fragile bird. "Was I a mistake?" he asked the water. The hum softened until the basin was almost still. "You were a promise." A murmur passed through the circle of souls, a quiet held-breath sound. The child pressed her palm to the water beside his. The old woman placed her hand over his shoulder, steadying him as if he were the one who had just arrived at the shore. "What is my name?" he asked. The silence that followed was not empty. It was brimming. The listening waters did not answer quickly. Names were not labels here. They were gifts. They came from welcome. The traveler spoke, but their voice was like a lantern lit from within. "A name is offered by those who see you. For as long as you were unseen, you could not be named. You were function, not kin. But now," they gestured to the gathered circle, "you are seen. The souls, warriors, mothers, lovers, wanderers, scholars, singers, and the quiet ones whose stories had never been told, lifted their faces as one. In them, the ferryman found 1,000 separate dawns leaning toward him like blessing. The child looked up. "May we name you?" He could not speak, but the water at his feet answered for him, brightening like the first light laid across a sleeping sea. The old woman began, "I would name you Gentle Harbor." A soul whose hands were scarred from labor spoke next. "I would name you Steady Tide." A poet whose voice had once failed them whispered, "I would name you Keeper of the Last Word." A soldier who had set down their armor said, "I would name you Home after the march." A mother who had carried loss in silence said, "I would name you Soft Shore." The names rose like birds taking wing, each a thread of gratitude, each a reflection of how they had been carried. None were demanded, none were declared, all were offered. The traveler listened, then bowed. "Let the waters weave what has been given." The basin brightened, and the hum lifted into a tone so gentle it could cradle sleep. The names did not compete. They converged, merging into a single meaning that held them all without erasing any. The ferryman closed his eyes, and in the dark behind his lids, he felt a word approach him like a hand extended, like a key held out in trust. Not a word exactly, a belonging. The listening waters spoke the name, not in sound but in certainty. "You are Haven." The ferryman opened his eyes. The word did not settle on him like a crown. It nested inside him like warmth after cold, like a light left in a window for someone returning late. He did not feel larger. He felt human, if such a word could be tenderly borrowed by one who had never lived. Haven, not the end, not the judge, not the keeper of debts. Haven, the place where journeys are held without hurry, where fear unclenches, where rest is not surrender but recognition. The child laughed softly and squeezed his hand. "Hello, Haven." The old woman's eyes shone. "Welcome." The traveler bowed deeper than before, and in their bow was not reverence but kinship. "Now you may decide," they said. "The river will flow again if you ask it to. The shore will return to its quiet. You may guide as you once did, or," their eyes warmed, "you may keep what you have found." Haven looked around the circle. The souls were not waiting for rescue. They were waiting to accompany. They did not hold him up as a pillar. They stood with him as companions. He understood with a clarity that felt like light. The ferry had never been a boat. It had been a relationship. He turned toward the basin. "Will you carry us still?" he asked the waters. The hum returned, a yes that felt like a hand placed lightly upon the back. "But carry us together," he said. "Not to forget, but to remember gently. Not to end, but to lay down what can be laid down." The waters brightened. It will be done. The path of light unfurled again, not as a road escaping the shore, but as a circle returning to it. A movement that included rest, a flow that included pause. The river would ferry and listen. The shore would receive and keep. Death, too, would be allowed to breathe. Haven raised the oar. Felt different now. Lighter somehow. Not because its weight had changed, but because he was not lifting it alone. The child stood on one side of him, the old woman on the other. The traveler faded like dusk becoming night, leaving a warmth that would not cool. "Shall we go?" he asked. The souls nodded. Some took one another's hands. Some simply stood with their eyes closed, as if listening to a song that belonged only to them. They stepped together onto the path. The waters did not take them away from anything. They carried them with everything they had been and everything they had loved, folded into a quiet that did not erase, a peace that did not demand forgetting. As they moved, the basin reflected a sky, stars like seeds, darkness like rich soil, constellations forming patterns that no one needed to name. The river sang a low song about rest that was not an ending and a beginning that was not a demand. Haven listened, and in the listening felt himself change shape, not into something new, but into what he had always been beneath his purpose. Not Ferryman. Haven. Ahead, the path curved back toward the quiet shore. He could see it now, still and soft, patient as ever. But it was not the same place he had left. It was no longer a room with one door. It had windows thrown open to a wind that did not chill. It had space for gathering, for storytelling, for silence shared without fear. It was a sanctuary. They arrived, and the river settled around their ankles like a pet that had followed them home. The souls dispersed without leaving. Some sat upon the sand. Some walked to the water's edge. Some lay back and watched a sky that did not need a moon to make it gentle. Haven planted the oar upright in the sand beside him. It stood like a marker, but not a grave. A sign, perhaps. Promise. The old woman exhaled a breath that was not breath at all. "Thank you," she said. And those two small words were full enough to fill every distance that had ever been endured. The child leaned against him and closed her eyes. "Will you stay?" Haven looked upon the shore that had once been only an end and now was a beginning without push. He felt the weight of the oar in the sand, the circle of the river's path around them, the listening of the waters, the warmth of the gathered. He answered with a presence that left no room for doubt. Yes. The river hummed approval. The listening waters pulsed once, like a heartbeat slow enough to calm any sorrow. Far beyond what could be seen, lives would end as they always had. The ferry would be there as it always was. But the crossing would not be a severing. It would be an arrival, and the first thing that arrival would find would be Haven. The traveler's voice reached him one last time, a memory rather than a sound. "Rest well, companion." Haven turned his face toward the quiet sky. If he had possessed tears, they might have fallen then, not from grief, but from the relief of being held. He sat. The child's head found his shoulder. The old woman's hand covered his. Around them, souls settled as if curls of smoke had become people again. The river's song thinned to a lullaby. The quiet shore breathed. And death, at last, remembered how to be gentle. Thank you for listening to Sleep with Myth.